Our experiment is on testing the effects of time pressure on performance and stress. The people in our group are me, Devin Keeney, Sarah Wingerden, Austin Allen, and Lauren Mineta. To start off our presentation, we're going to talk about some research articles that we used for background information on our experiment. The research article I'm going to be talking about is on the effect of time constraints and personality on general cognitive ability. Some researchers believe that how a person performs based on time constraints could be related to an individual's personality. They found that during general cognitive ability assessments, GCA, the majority of participants' scores reflected poorly to time constrictions. Testing this, researchers used two administration modes, known as speed mode and power mode. Speed mode is when the test must be completed with added time pressure, and power mode is when there is less time constriction in order to complete a test. Each of the participants in this study were asked to complete a multiple choice test known as Watson-Glaser Critical Thinking Appraisal Test, WG-CTAT. The Watson-Glaser Critical Thinking Appraisal Test is used to predict the capabilities of employees in their future careers. All participants were first told to complete the first 40 questions within 40 minutes, speed mode. After, they were given an additional 35 minutes, power mode, to make alterations and improvements to their work with a separate colored pencil. The researchers observed the results of two separate studies for this hypothesis. The first study included fewer than 100 individuals. These individuals were given evaluations from their employers after completing the WG-CTAT under both modes. The second study included over 1,000 individuals. These individuals completed the WG-CAT under both administrative modes, and then completed a personality test known as NEO. This personality test measures key personality factors including neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeability, and conscientiousness. After collecting the data from these studies, the researchers found that there was a greater reliability in the power mode in comparison to the speed mode, regardless of some exceptions within the individual's personality differences. Some of the individuals had personalities that enabled them to be unaffected from speed mode, while others were stunted by it. This is related to those individuals that have greater anxiety levels. In regards to the individual's personality traits, those who had higher neuroticism, impulsivity, and anxiety factors had the most significant gain from the power mode. Researchers came to the conclusion that the majority of individuals greatly improved in accuracy and performance when they did not have any restrictions, compared to when they were given time restrictions. This experiment helps to explain the relationship between time pressure and personality traits and how they both have the ability to affect scores and performance.
Some researchers believe that time pressure affects both responses and processing. In order to test this hypothesis, researchers conducted an experiment with a group of 16 students. They manipulated both the type of visuals presented to the individual and the amount of time they had to complete their task in order to measure their response and processing of the stimuli, Dombacher and Hubert, 2015. After receiving consent, each participant was seated in front of a monitor. They were given instructions and then had to complete 3 trials. After the completion of each trial, the time pressure decreased from 450 milliseconds to 550 milliseconds to 650 milliseconds. Each time the screen appeared, it showed stimuli that were either congruent or incongruent. The stimulus was shown on the screen for the set amount of time and went blank until the participants answered the question. Following each of the trials, students were told whether their responses were wrong or right, and if they were too fast or too slow. After the trials were complete, researchers measured the results and found that the faster the participants had to respond to the stimulus, the less accurate they were. Dombacher and Hubner, 2015. Students had better responses in perceptual processing when given more time to complete their task compared to when they were given less time to complete the task. This experiment displays the effects of time constraints on both responsiveness and processing of the participants.
The next research article discussed the effect of time constraints in statistics test anxiety on test performance in a statistics course. Researchers believed that by adding time constrictions to exams, that it negatively impacts students' scores. These researchers conducted an experiment in which students had to complete a statistics achievement exam, or SAE. Prior to the exam, each participant took a test in class anxiety subscale of the statistic and Statistical Anxiety Rating Scale, STARS, and in Background Informational Form, BIF. The researchers randomly assigned the statistics students into their levels of the manipulation to enhance the experiment's internal reliability. They manipulated the amount of time the students had to complete their test. One group had a set amount of time of 90 minutes in which they had to complete their test by, while the second group had no time limit on their test. The researchers ensured that all the students took the test under the same conditions. Both sets took the test on the same day, at the same time, in similar adjacent classrooms. After the exam, the authors measured the outcome of the data for each student's score based on the level they were put into. The researchers found that the students that were given a time constraint performed poorly compared to those who were not. The STARS rating scale allowed researchers to measure the scores of each student and compare their scores to their level of anxiety based on the time condition that they were placed in. Taking this into consideration, the researchers found that not having any added time pressure was even more beneficial to the students who had high test anxiety compared to those who had low testing anxiety. Therefore, the students that have testing anxiety likely have this anxiety due to the time limitations they are given on their tests. The authors state that students with test anxiety likely would improve an entire letter grade when the obstacle of time pressure was taken off the table. Therefore, the researchers concluded that students perform better on exams when they are not given any time constraints compared to when they are given a time limitation. This expands on the relevance of how test anxiety and time pressure negatively impact student scores.
For this research article called Reappraising Test Anxiety Increases Academic Performance for First-Year College Students, looks into how fear about performance and anxiety are the cause for impairment in performance rather than bodily feelings of anxiety. Looking through the lens of anxiety reappraisal encourages us to look at anxiety as either neutral or a helpful tool that can improve student performance. Thus, for this experiment, they had two groups of students that received an email the night before an exam, and half of the group's email had a paragraph leading to the students interpreting their anxiety as something beneficial or neutral, while the other half of the group did not. The results displayed that first-year students that had received the anxiety reappraisal message had a decrease in worry with increased performance on the test and in the course overall, compared to the other group which had not received the message. However, this message had not affected the performance of the upper year students. This study displays how first-year students are more heavily impacted in dealing with test anxiety. This also indicates that test performance is affected by more than just those with anxiety, but people that also worry and stress about exams.
Methods. The design used was a post-test design. The participants were randomly assigned using a between-group design. The purpose of using this design was to evaluate the effect of random assignment on the two groups after the post-test. The experiment tested the levels of difficulty and stress participants experienced between a timed or untimed test. In this experiment, participants aged 18 to 25 from universities within the United States. The participants were known previously to all researchers. Communication was carried out throughout email, and there was no compensation associated with taking part in the experiment. 68 participants took this survey. 34 participants took the untimed version, and 34 participants took the timed version. In regards to the materials, the experiment was performed using Qualtrics. Both groups used the same instructional video from YouTube. How does a credit card work? The credit card video was used to teach participants about the usage of credit cards to allow researchers to test for knowledge recall on this topic. The measured aspect of this study was the self-reported answer to the question, did having timed questions add to your overall stress while taking the test? 1 being not stressed at all to 5 being very stressed. For the procedure, participants consented to watching the 5-minute video, completing 15 questions as well as a follow-up survey. Participants were randomly assigned to one of two groups, timed and untimed groups. Both groups were asked to watch a 5-minute YouTube video about how credit card works. After, both groups completed 15 questions about the content of the video they watched. However, the timed group had 30 seconds to answer per question, whereas the untimed group had unlimited time. When completed, participants were asked 3 follow-up survey questions. These questions consisted of how difficult the test was, how familiar the subject was to the topic prior to the video, and if having to get above an 85% under time pressure added stress.
On this first graph, it shows the participants' responses, with the x-axis showing the blue being the untimed proportion and the red being the timed group. On the x-axis, it represents how difficult the participants felt the test was, with 1 being not difficult at all and 5 being very difficult. In this graph, it shows each individual response, and overall, our red group, the time group, had perceived the test to be more difficult than our blue group, which was untimed. The second graph has the same format as the first, in representing the same distribution of our participants, but this time measuring their stress level. The untimed group in blue, while our timed group in red, with 1 being feeling no stress at all, and 5 being feeling very stressed. As seen on the graph, the red group, our timed group, was noted in feeling higher levels of stress than our blue group, which was untimed. Our third graph displays the average of difficulty for the timed and our untimed group. Each bar represents the average difficulty felt for each group, with our red, our timed group, having a 3.41, and our blue group, which is our untimed group, having a 3.03. There was also the standard mean of error, plus or minus 2, is also shown, and since the sample has overlapping within the error bars, there is no significance between how difficult the two groups found the test. In our last graph, it also shows the average of stress perceived for each group, with red being timed and blue being untimed. The timed group had an average of 2.83, while our untimed blue group had an average of 1.97. The standard mean of error, plus or minus 2, was also calculated for this graph, and there was no overlapping between the error bars, so there was significance between how stressed the groups were when taking the test. In this table, it shows the average, median, max, min, standard deviation, and standard error of mean plus or minus 2 for our timed in red and our untimed in blue. The timed group had a lower average and max for both the stress and difficulty compared to our timed group. There was a 0.38 difference in the average between the timed and untimed group for difficulty, and a 0.86 difference between the groups for stress. The timed group also had a max at 5 for each category, which was our highest option within our Likert scale, while our untimed group had a max of only 4 for difficulty and 3 for stress.
This experiment accumulates the hypothesis that the timed group would experience more stress when taking the test compared to the group that was untimed. Timed difficulty was only slightly higher on average by 0.38 than the untimed group. Stress was higher on average by 0.83 than the untimed group. Therefore, there is a significant difference between their perceptions of stress when participants were timed and untimed. The group that was timed experienced more stress compared to the group that was not timed. This is consistent with research about timed versus untimed experiments and the effects that they have on both stress and performance. Researchers confirmed that reducing time pressure on statistics exams was beneficial to the overall performance of students on Wugboozy and Seaman, 1995. In the current experiment, participants who had experienced unlimited time performed higher than those who had performed under time pressure. This is also shown in previous research when participants were given more time to complete a task on perception. Their processing and response accuracy was higher when compared to less time, Dombacher and Huber, 2015. Furthermore, this was consistent with researchers' findings, in which less time restrictions allowed for improvements in accuracy and overall performance based on participants' GCA scores. Dennis and Gilbert, 2012. Participants with the current experiment reported that with the higher time constraints, more stress was added on to their experience taking their exams. This is consistent in findings where researchers also found that within the workplace, employees who had less time constraints were also more productive and had overall better mental health compared to their coworkers who had higher time pressure placed on them. Muehlek-Meyer et al., 2022. Future experiments should take into account issues to validity. One problem that may have affected the data collected is that participants might have guessed what the purpose of the experiment was and in turn tried to perform in the expected way designed for the study, affecting the results of the experiment. This is defined as demand characteristics internal validity threat. In order to test for this, it may be important for future researchers to include a question in the post-test asking whether or not the participant knew what the purpose of the exam was. As a result of this post-test question, the experimenters will be able to see which participants' results would have been affected. Another internal validity problem in this experiment could be a design confound. A design confound would occur if the length of the test participants take after watching the educational video was too long and created fatigue or boredom from the topic that they weren't interested in. It would be important to take into consideration the length of the test, and this study attempts to control this confound by shortening the number of post-test questions. This study will allow researchers to determine the effects of untimed versus timed stress on stress and performance. This is especially important in regards to students, considering the time restrictions can cause negative effects on students' grades and overall performance, affecting the ability to get an accurate assessment of their skills. Lower test scores were not only linked to time, but the catalyst for the lower test scores is also the amount of stress surrounding a test that is being timed, which results in the test taker having lower test scores. This current experiment concluded that there is an increased amount of stress under timed conditions when compared to untimed conditions. If people become more aware of the different types of influences that result in lower performance and increased stress, then there are strategies that can be implemented to mitigate these negative effects while people are taking an exam. In that case, this could result in obtaining more accurate representation of people's test scores and performance.